Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in relation to things like community building, urbanization, population. So we last time we talked about this, we talked about the interrelatedness of everything, so that with the growing, like I think we're at 8 billion at the moment in the world. So when we think about it on a global level, the population has risen exponentially over the last 70 years even. So how is this having an impact on resources and on other related things like poverty and well-being? So Alan, shall I start with you then? So from your perspective, being a coach and doing the work that you're doing and being kind of like interested in sustainability, so for you, how do these things interrelate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm just kind of trying to take it all in. But yeah, but I think yeah, definitely when we're talking about, an increase in populations, and a finite set of resources, and and you have there are certain, certain resources that are being, used up, like wood, and but as people grow, and there's just less resources per person. So you have situations in places like Indonesia where there is rampant deforestation that is happening. In places like Borneo that used to be covered with trees, many of those trees are gone. And I just remember watching a video of this orangutan, attacking a bulldozer, because the bulldozer was basically chopping, basically unrooting, the tree, its home, and it has nowhere to go. And it made me feel really, I felt really bad for this animal, that this animal could be so upset at what we are doing. But obviously with population increase, we're extracting these resources, and a lot of these resources are not going to come back. There's a lot of animals that are disappearing, so we are losing biodiversity. A lot of what we consider to be common animals, tigers, elephants, a lot of those animals are disappearing. And we often talk about, like invasive species, animals that, that happen to be in a certain environment, like I don't know, like how the brown snakes in Guam, and or the yeah. And we think about these types of animals that are invasive, and they destroy everything. But over the years I've reflected, could we, be an invasive species? And in many ways I do feel that we have a role to play on this planet, and we are responsible for a lot of the loss of biodiversity. And we have a responsibility to the planet, and we have a responsibility for the sustainability of not just ourselves but all other life forms. So that's my initial thoughts.
Yeah. Well, China had a, policy to reduce the population in China by saying, was it one child per family, was it? Or two children per family? I can't remember.
It's up to three. It's up to three now. They are, yeah, I remember. Yeah, that's a very, very complicated question, but yeah.
I think it was even as harsh as one child per family, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
So that was their way of dealing with overpopulation. So in order for the population to grow, obviously you need to have 2.1 births per family, because you need the mother and the father to be replaced, and then a little bit more just to accommodate for any accidental deaths. And so when you bring it below, when you restrict it to one, of course the population, cannot grow, and it's creating a lot of social problems, because now you have because in a healthy society, you need to have a certain percentage of people contributing to the economy, and they have like 30, I think up to 30% of China's population is considered elderly. You have people in their 40s. They have to, they're not just responsible for raising kids, but they have to support how many people? Like maybe up to six people. It's your mother, your father, your maternal, paternal grandfather, maternal, paternal grandmother. That's up to six elderly people, and then of course your own kids, and then you have to support yourself. It's not exactly a sustainable situation that we have going on in China.
Mhm. And Chris, your comments on this, because I think it was in the 70s that
Mhm.
very harsh policy was put in place. What are
Mhm.
your thoughts on that?
It'd be interesting to see how it worked actually, but the Alan puts his finger on it that in order to sustain an elderly population, as we're especially in the Western world, which we're all growing older, we need a population of young people to pay their taxes and keep us going. One of the problems in this country is that the government ran a Ponzi scheme where you thought you were putting money in for your old age, when in fact they were spending it on other things. So and now people have to work longer and longer before they can retire, because the government hasn't got the money to sustain it, and they've known since 1945 when there was a growth spurt in the population after the war, that this cohort of baby boomers was going to come through, but they made no provision for it. So successive governments, that is, it's not just one particular party. So there's maladministration on top of demography, so and poor planning.
Yeah, that's right. Because when we talk about sustainability, we have to think long term. And it's as though all of these policies, like the one child per family policy and the pensions thing, it seems to be based on very short term thinking. Like maybe think about the impact in 10 years' time, but what about in 80 years' time? Have they thought long enough to think about what's going to happen at the other end of it? Yeah, go ahead, Alan. You have something to say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just wanted to add to what is making the one child policy even worse. Like in this day and age, like 20% of China's youth is actually unemployed at the moment. And like you have all these people that went through college and university, and they come out and they're expecting these high paying jobs. But China predominantly, it's predominantly a manufacturing country, so it's a lot of, factory labor. And so a lot of young people cannot get the jobs that they studied and prepared for. And those that are working, they work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and they do it like six days a week. So it's a really frustrating situation. They're not getting the wages that they feel that they should be getting. They're not able to. They're working all this time, and they don't have the ability to secure property.
Well, let's link this to education, Alan,
Yeah.
because it goes back to, we've discussed this so many times before, that
Mhm.
the purpose of education, like the purpose of the Western
Mhm.
education, but here we're talking about China.
Yeah.
But I can only talk about the West because this is, where I've
Yeah. Sure.
my experience. But the purpose of education seems to be, well, do like get all the education you can. Then you have the right to expect a good job at the other end of it.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like the purpose of education shouldn't be about getting a job. The purpose of education needs to be able to be creative enough to create work for ourselves, to create work that is meaningful. So that's linking back to the sustainable goals as well. Like, what is decent work?
Yeah.
Decent work. If we claim to be so educated, then why is it that we are still expecting others to give us a job rather than creating work for others?
That is a really good question. But I think that is the general mentality is you get a job because you want to make money. And a lot of the things that they train you to go to school for is not necessarily directed towards any of the UN sustainability goals or I mean things like they want to get people out of agriculture, and they want they train you to do things like work in a factory. And for a long time it was considered an achievement if somebody who was traditionally from an agricultural family, they were able to make their way and get good money by working in a city as an engineer or as a computer programmer. We tend to congratulate people who made that switch. But is it necessarily a good thing, is something that I question. Is it necessarily something that is aligned with these UN Sustainable Development Goals? Did we, are we, is education, preparing people to contribute to a more sustainable future? That's another thing that I think is also important to think about. And is education also preparing to develop the whole individual, develop their sense of passion, so that they can give back to the environment, the community, and the world as a whole? Yeah.
Yeah, so somebody who succeeds in becoming the CEO of a company making polystyrene cups, is that
Mm-hmm.
work? Is that the sign of success because they live in a mansion, because they have made all this profit from making plastics and landfills and all the rest of it? Is that in alignment with sustainability? And Chris, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it depends on the curriculum in education, and there's a teacher in Birmingham, and he teaches in a primary school up in the outskirts of Birmingham, a place called Shard End. So you can imagine what sort of a place Shard End is from its name. And he puts food at the center of the curriculum. So he every lesson, say geography, will be looking at sources of food, or if it was going to be science, then the actual makeup of food, and so that if you build into the curriculum right from the very start the whole notion of sustainability, and that nothing is innocent, is it? Nothing is that we learn has much wider implications. So if you're going to learn about computers, then it's computers for a purpose, and how computers both are manufactured and what they're used for. But a few weeks ago, I got involved with a local group calling themselves Civic Square, and they're linked up to an economist called Katie Rayworth, and she's written a book called Donut Economics, and it's a very simple concept, and they're actually teaching it to primary school children, that the economic model is a donut, and so in the center it is everything that goes to make life good, and helps our well-being, and so like good housing, good food, all the rest of it. Then you have two concentric circles, so that's the donut, and within that donut is everything that is sustainable that is within the boundaries of the world in terms of its resources, and outside the donut is everything that that isn't within the world's resources, which we shouldn't be using, like fossil fuels, and well, you know the whole setup. So it's a very simple framework, but it's one that needs to be put into action all around the world, really, so that people are thriving themselves, and so there's equal distribution of wealth, and B, that everything that we work within our means as a species. So I recommend the book, but it's not a difficult concept. But but once you start delving into it, it kind of imposes on us a duty to act in a sustainable fashion.
Well, Chris, the donut economics, it's a very important concept. But when you were talking about the primary school children and looking at the core of that donut and everything that makes life good, for example, food and housing, I haven't seen the donut concept for a while, but is fame and wealth, is that part of the center? Because the reason I asked that question is because so many children these days, they think that the purpose of life is to become famous and to be a celebrity and to make lots of money. But are those kind of part of what makes life beautiful, fame and fortune?
Well, I mean, she enunciates several steps, personal steps that you have to take to change your mindset. So that will be part of changing your mindset from looking at what we have already, because as she says, nothing is it's all created by human beings. It's not part of the setup of the world. It is actually in fact the laws and customs and traditions, they're all made up, and given our sustainable goals, then we've got to change how we think and change the rules that are all man-made, and so, as you say, fame and fortune is a subjectivization of the world rather than looking at the objective facts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'm sensing a disconnect. I think when you're pursuing fame and fortune, it's your preoccupation is with your own ego, and what I don't see as a connection to other people, to other creatures, to the plants, to the world. You're not seeing yourself as part of that domain. You're seeing yourself as separate, and I do find that problematic.
Mm. But you see, this relates to this whole concept of urbanization, because Chris, I know that you and I have talked about the Dick Whittington story previously, like Dick Whittington. Alan, do you know Dick Whittington? He traveled to London because he thought the streets of London were paved with gold. And so it's a story of people migrating to the cities from the rural areas, in search of fame and fortune, basically. So there's this kind of, and then there's the travel the other way around. London is a city which becomes more and more unaffordable the longer you live there. I lived in London when I was in my 20s, 30s, 40s, and as I grew older, it became like it was no longer sustainable for me to live in that city, and I moved to a smaller city. So in terms of like how this kind of compels people, the inequalities between what is available in the urban environments compared with what's available in the rural environments, and the attractiveness of what the other offers, like in later life, maybe the rural environment offers more to the older generation compared with the younger generation, their move to go to the cities for this concept of, for the desire for fame and fortune. So what are your thoughts on that, Chris? The Dick Whittington story, the streets paved with gold, is that are we kind of educating the generations to kind of live in overcrowded conditions and live unsustainable lives in the cities? Is there something that we can do to look at that more clearly?
Well, I mean, there's a Latin phrase, "rus in orbe," which means countryside or countryside in the town. And if we maintain a strict separation between the built environment and the green environment, then I think we are on a hiding to nothing. So we need to have towns where the countryside is penetrating the town, and maybe the town is moving into the countryside. I mean, as it stands at the moment, that the big cities are regional economic engines, and then there's dormitory suburbs round about, and people go into the city to work, then move out into the suburbs or into their little villages around about, but they're not self-sustaining. It's the city that creates the wealth. I mean, in the Middle Ages, the cities were seen as a place of freedom and away from the medieval oppression of the feudal system. And that's where we get the word citizen. It's people who live in cities. So you want to create that sense of freedom, sense of endeavor, and at the same time rethink how you're going to rethink your relationship with nature and with the natural world, which is the primary economy. It's not an external feature. The nature is the economy, and the rest is a subset of nature. So if we destroy nature, then we've destroyed our whole economy.
Yes, and so do you think that the political agenda about levelling up, do you think that is one of the ways to address this issue, like to level up? Does it mean bring the city into the countryside and the countryside into the city? Would that help?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, we have to start thinking now of how we can create a green economy and move away from extractive projects, mining and searching for oil and the rest of it. But so yeah, that has to happen in the old industrial quarters, and jobs probably has to go to areas where there's high unemployment and a need for people to be masters of their own destiny.
Well, Alan lives in Singapore, and the impression, I've never been to Singapore, but the impression I have of Singapore, to me, it just seems as though it's one big city. Is there a danger of England or the UK becoming one great big city, that we lose the countryside altogether and it all becomes urbanized because of the increasing population here? So Alan, is Singapore a great big city, or do you have like a balance of nature and urbanization?
I think they do try. It is a very green city, and I think they describe Singapore as the garden city. And there's a lot of, if you actually visit it, there's a lot of parks, there's a lot of sustainable, clean energy sorts of initiatives. There's a lot of good things that can be said about Singapore, but at the same time, there's a lot of bad things that can be said. Like a lot of things like land reclamation, that's just to accommodate a growing population. But there's a lot of environmental initiatives, but Singapore doesn't really have large natural areas because it's a city state. So if you wanted to enjoy Singapore, you have to go to a place like, you have to travel to a nearby country like Malaysia or Indonesia. It's really, I mean, they have, they have certain pockets of nature, but it's really hard to appreciate and enjoy nature and to be in to have a relationship with nature, to be in a space where you can contemplate your relationship with nature. It's kind of hard to do that here in a place that's very populated, and where there isn't a whole lot of privacy.
Do you have
Yeah.
an agricultural section or other farms?
Supposedly we do, but I just couldn't tell you where that is. But if I remember the statistics, yeah, like there's like 8% of our food is being produced within Singapore, and we're trying to raise that number. But there is some farming going on. There's a lot of vertical farming, like doing farming on the top of roofs. So there is an attempt for Singapore. Singapore, of course, always wants to be. They don't want to be in a position to rely on Malaysia for water. So we actually found a way to purify to keep our water pure, and we actually sell our water to Malaysia, which is in need of our clean water. So we're always looking for ways to be self-sustainable and not have to rely on Malaysia or any other countries. So of course we are interested in growing our own food and using whatever resources we can to produce our food, because a lot of it is imported, and of course we want to lower that.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of Hawaii as well, that it's not that, even though there is a lot of nature in Hawaii, it's still not self-sufficient. It still relies on the US. The majority of its food is imported, and that's why it's so expensive. But I, here in England, when I was teaching in London, younger children, like 16 to 18-year-olds, some of my students, they weren't quite sure where their food came from. And I think that is unsustainable as well. It's if we don't know, let's say the avocados or even
chocolate. People don't even know what cacao looks like, the plant that chocolate is made from. They don't know. They just eat it. They don't know what where it comes from.
Yes. And things like palm oil, like palm oil is, you talk about the orangutans and so many of the products that we eat, it contains palm oil, and we don't connect the dots and see that what we're eating is causing that deforestation. That's an issue as well.
Yeah, there's a definite disconnect.
Yeah. I read a book review of a book's just come out called The Darkness Manifesto, and it's really about the dangers of light pollution. And because I'm interested in this, because they're going to build on our local nature reserve, and that's going to create 24/7 light and noise pollution. And in the book, he was saying things like moths. They're attracted to light. They can't tell the difference between natural light and artificial light, so they're attracted to light, and they circle around until they're exhausted and die. But moths are great pollinators. They said they're great. They're just as good as bees in terms of pollinating the world. And he goes into all the ways that light interferes with the life cycle of insects and flora and fauna. But he does say that the world is losing insect population by about 3% a year. So that's not sustainable, because at that micro level, if we don't pay attention, it's going to undermine all our life support systems. So you're right. That's all. Light is all part of urbanization, and the fact that we can't go out at night and see the night sky because there's too much interference.
So do you think that a lot of this goes to population control? Because when we look at these sustainable goals, population isn't kind of clearly, because I suppose it's a controversial one, isn't it? The population control. And people expect that with more and more education, that the population will naturally drop, because we see that in countries where there's a high level of education and a high level of industrialization, naturally people tend to have less children. They don't need to be educated to have less children. They just do have less children because their priorities are different. So do you think that we're maybe not focusing as much as we need to on this whole issue of like population control?
Well, I mean, why do they want large families? I mean, is it to do with ignorance, or is it to do with the agricultural economy, which needs lots of intense labor? What's the because it's not a rational thing to have a large family and have to create all those many mouths to feed. Why is the work? I mean, obviously there's a Malthusian thing about population, but what's the motivation for people to have
Okay.
children?
In places like China, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore, this is actually a big deal. People not having children. And so some of the problems, if people are not having if people aren't having children, it creates a situation where you have less people that are actively contributing to the economy, and then you have all these people that are very elderly that need to be supported. And when I heard about China, by 2050 there will be one person working for every elderly person not working that needs to be cared for by the system. And so China has a very awful problem, and it's a problem that they created for themselves through initiatives like the one child policy. I think Korea has a birth rate of like 0.98. That's way below the 2.1 that is needed to sustain the population. I know in Singapore, it's also a very big deal. But I think if we're you do want an economy where you have a good chunk of people that are able to work and generate tax revenue for the country.
And I suppose that people who have more children than the average, religion is related to it as well. Not everyone believes in birth control, and some people believe that contraceptives are kind of they're against kind of like the principles of life.
Yeah, I mean in Catholicism, it was it's still there. The family planning is, in terms of using contraceptives, is forbidden religiously. I don't think the Catholic population pays much heed to it because they just fall in line with the rest of the population. But Islam is another area where I don't think they believe in contraception either, and so they're liable for large families. So there is definitely a religious element, yes.
Mm. Yeah, and again, like in countries like, let's say, Kuwait, for example, where there's I'm not sure if the families would be as large in a small country, because I think of Kuwait and Singapore in a similar way. Like I see them both as cities urbanized, and Dubai, for example. So wherever there's urbanization, and when people are attracted to live in an urban environment, and both parents are working, then the tendency would be for the families to be smaller because they can't look after the children.
It's very expensive to have kids. I mean, not only do you have to have kids, if you have kids, you have to have a big space. You have to buy a home. You have to send them to something. They don't. There are countries that don't have free public education. They have to pay for their kids' education, and in places like in many countries in Asia, they don't just go to school; they go to after-school school. We call it tuition to help them prepare for their O levels or their A levels. There are, it's then maybe you send them to universities, and and plus, everything that's expensive about living in a city. It's not very practical for many young people today to have children. It's not something that they can even think about. Even if they want to do it, they just can't. I mean, a lot of these people, they go through and they spend all this money on acquiring a university education, and then they don't necessarily have a job that's available for them that pays in proportion, that pays for for them to pay off their educational loans. And also, it's just and then the economy hasn't been very stable. There's all this inflation, and prices keep going up, and wages are stagnant. It's just not practical for many people to want to have kids.
Well, I mean,
That's the yeah.
Other animal species, their kids are up and running after a couple of years. Well,
Yeah.
you say their socialization is taking more and more years.
Yeah.
And another thing is about people having tertiary education. It's not parceled out, is it? I mean, for instance, it was perceived that at one time that if you wanted to get on in life, then you became an accountant. Except there's now too many accountants, or too many people with accountancy qualifications, or because it's now overloaded. And so there are certain professions that seem to, law is another one, which attracts a lot of people, and yet there isn't enough opportunities for all the people who are qualified. So it's a very unplanned thing, is tertiary education, and the way that you choose your subjects.
Well, as I listen to you both, and so say, for example, if somebody's a lawyer or somebody's a doctor or somebody's an accountant, and they, like, when they're thinking about the choice about whether to have children or not to have children, they will think, well, can we afford to have more than 2 children? Because they envisage their children being at least as successful as they are, either doctors or lawyers or accountants. Whereas somebody who doesn't have that level of like standard, because they're not doctors, they're not lawyers, they work in a factory, they won't necessarily be thinking about, well, can I afford to have more than 2 children? Because they're not thinking about university, because they didn't go to university. So for them, ironically, it may be much more affordable to have 4 or 5 children, because they're not planning on paying for their university education, because they didn't receive it themselves. Whereas the doctor and the lawyer and the accountant, they are thinking that far ahead, because they don't want to raise children who they can't afford to educate.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, so it does make sense.
Yeah. So are you saying the kind of the professional classes, they're not producing enough brainy children, as it were, or people who could take an education?
No, I'm just saying that that's probably one of the reasons why in places where there is a high level of education, the birth control falls, because the highly educated people are making decisions which are at a higher level, I suppose, in terms of what their expectations are. Whereas like somebody who I mean, again, like going back to my teaching days in London, I had children, 16-year-olds in my class who came from very disadvantaged backgrounds, and they came from large families, and sometimes I used to wonder, like, why their parents had chosen to have so many children who they couldn't afford to look after. So, whereas professional teachers like myself working in that same environment, we didn't have children, or some of my colleagues had a couple of children at most, but they hadn't made the same kind of choices to have so many poor children in who we saw on a daily basis in our classes.
Yeah, I think the other resource is time. I think if you are busy, I don't know, working in a factory or whatever job that you have, you need to have there needs to be a certain level of leisure time so that you can meet the right person and reproduce. And there are a lot of people that just they don't actually have that resource because they are busy struggling to make ends meet in an urban environment, because the cost of living in an urban environment is very high. Whereas in places like, I don't know, Cambodia or Bali, or other rural parts of Indonesia, those populations, they are having kids. They have birth rates that are 2.7 or higher. Yeah.
It reminds me of the old French joke about a visitor to a village saying, "Why are there so many children in this village?" And said, "Well, it's the 6:30 train wakes everybody up, and it's too early to get up to go to work, and too late to go back to sleep again."
Yeah. So you see, it all links up with well-being as well, doesn't it? Like you have to have the leisure time available for people to meet and to socialize and to interact. Whereas in urban environments, a lot of that, leisure time is spent traveling from one place to the other.
Well, it certainly is in London. The amount of time you've got to spend commuting is quite horrific, especially if the house prices are so high. You then got to go and live outside of London to get a cheaper house, almost.
And there we talk about two different elements of the sustainable goals, because the traveling, that in itself is unsustainable, not only because of the time, but also the resources. So we're wasting so many resources just simply, getting from work, not being able to afford to, for example, here, when I work at the university, I still have to travel. It's about maybe half an hour, 40 minutes.
Yeah.
I couldn't afford to live right next door to my university. It's just too expensive then. So we kind of like get priced out of being able to live close to where we work.
Yeah. I guess one good thing that happened as a result of the COVID pandemic was there has been a lot of reflection on remote work, and being able to interact with your colleagues online. And so there has been a lot of attention paid to working from home, work-life balance, the idea that you could hire smart people anywhere in the world, from a place like India or Boston, or any country in the world. You can get talent from anywhere. You can save money, and you don't need to have to run the air conditioning so much, so you can be more sustainable in the office. You can invest in better equipment, like sit to stand desks to help people with their posture or whatever. So there's a lot of but I think the being able to work remotely, nowadays it is you don't have to be in a city to work. You can actually have your cake and eat it too. You can actually like you can actually work on a beach and do your thing, or in the middle of a jungle, provided there is some 5G Wi-Fi service. So I do think that things are changing that allow us to be in nature more, and we don't have to be so urban dependent.
In Birmingham, they've created this super duper fast train line the HS2 from London to Birmingham. And where I live, they're building a lot of houses because they're saying, you know, that the people will move into Birmingham so that they're next to the HS2 and they can get into London very quickly. And that sort of Birmingham has now become a suburb of London, even though it's 100 miles away. But since COVID, it's been interesting to see how many people want to A, move into Birmingham, and B, commute to London on a regular basis, given, you know, the remote working that is possible now. So that's kind of an old model that didn't anticipate the plague.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the demographics are changing. More and more people, especially the younger generation, are choosing to live in the countryside rather than moving towards the cities. But this leaves me to kind of like talk about the, you know, like if more and more people, more and more city dwellers are moving into the rural environments, is that going to be like, and, you know, all these kind of internet kind of providers moving into the rural environments, is that going to damage the ecosystem, or is it, you know, going to be more beneficial than adverse?
Yeah, I would think the jury's out on that at the moment. I mean, on the face of it, it would look like it's more sustainable, but there's always these unknowns that are suddenly there when you start operating a new system.
Yeah. Well, with the COP27 having just finished, and you know, do you think like there's room to be optimistic about some of the discussions that have gone on there, or do you think that every year, like, so it's like we're at 27, we've had 27 of these kind of major conferences. Does anything actually beneficial, kind of dramatically beneficial, arise from these things, or is it just going to be talk for another few decades?
Well, it's I mean, people get together the best will in the world, but there's all this self-interest that goes on. So I mean, while they're discussing climate change, Russia is invading Ukraine. It doesn't have very good environmental consequences, and that's just come out of the blue. So I don't know if we're ever in a position to do the right thing. You know, if we be a bit pessimistic about it all, and yet the people who are leading us do know what the consequences are, and yet Britain's still investing in North Sea oil fields, and then they want to introduce atomic energy. So they you know, white man speak with forked tongue. There's this hypocrisy that goes on all the while, even though that there's a certain virtue signaling about let's do something about climate change. But I don't think people they're actually protecting the population, I think, from the horrors that they're going to engulf us, not in, you know, when the water levels start to rise and major cities suddenly find that they're underwater. It's they haven't really contemplated the doomsday scenario properly.
Yeah. Yeah, because London is very kind of close, isn't it, to like the risks of major flooding.
Yeah, just really quick. I think the war in Ukraine, it is the result of the thinking of a few people. You know, I think what I find valuable about democracy, even though none of our countries are perfect. I think having democracy is important in order to ensure that we do things that benefit all of us and not just the few people. I think it's important to practice democracy, not just when you go to the polls and you vote, but it's also, I think democracy is how you live your life and how you include others and how you work together to solve problems and how you make decisions together on a daily basis, you know, outside of political elections.
Yes, and I suppose it's to do with again, like earlier on, we were talking about ownership and accountability and responsibility. Democracy can work if everyone takes ownership, if everyone is responsible and accountable for what's going on. Whereas I suppose one of the weaknesses of democracies is that too many people allow others to make decisions for them.
Yeah.
Don't even bother to.
And then we blame them for our problems. Yeah.
And also that there should be a free flow of information. So, I mean, with an autocracy, there's certain bits of information that they will not allow the population to know because it weakens their power. But if there's an open source of information that people can then make informed decisions, then that's a much healthier scenario, I think.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you both, Alan and Chris. Thank you very much for
Thank you.
and